The aroma of grilling meat hung heavy, but Mark Jensen saw only Sarah Miller, her head thrown back in a laugh, her hand resting light on Greg Davis's arm. Greg, his expensive watch gleaming, leaned in close, whispering something that made her smile widen. Mark, a few feet away, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, a public dismissal that left him suddenly exposed, the party noise fading to a dull hum. Greg caught his eye, a quick, dismissive flick, before turning his full attention back to Sarah, his smile unwavering. Mark Jensen drove his usual route through downtown Kansas City, the morning traffic a familiar hum. He worked as a contract manager for Midwest Holdings, a job that typically demanded his full attention, a precision of mind. But lately his thoughts drifted. The steel and glass towers outside his window seemed less imposing, his spreadsheets less urgent. A quiet disquiet had settled over him, a sense of something shifting at home, subtly like frost beneath pavement. For 7 years, he and Sarah Miller had built a life steady and predictable. Now a distance was growing between them, an invisible wall. Sarah's routines had changed. New names surfaced in her conversations, people Mark didn't know, part of a new social circle she'd cultivated through her boutique. Work, once his anchor, now felt like a distraction from the unease churning inside him. His mind, usually sharp, kept returning to Sarah, her quiet phone calls, the way she sometimes looked past him. She had mentioned a networking dinner a few weeks back. An investment guy, she'd said, casual, almost an afterthought. Greg Davis. The name had stirred a bad feeling, a vague premonition Mark couldn't explain. He tried to quell his instincts. He's just a friend, right? He'd mused, forcing the thought away. But it lingered, a burr under the saddle. A flicker of memory surfaced. Greg's silver Lexus, a car Mark now recognized, parked discreetly down their block one Tuesday evening. Sarah had seemed tense when Mark came home early that night, fussing with her hair, too quickly, saying she'd been working late on designs. Later that week, Mark brought home white roses, a spur-of-the-moment gesture to bridge the gap he felt widening. Sarah's reaction was muted. She thanked him, placed them in a vase, but her phone buzzed almost immediately, drawing her attention away. Just some design updates, she said too quickly, about the new fall line for her boutique. The words sounded hollow. They ate stir-fry that night in near silence. The clink of forks against ceramic the loudest sound in the kitchen. Sarah's eyes kept darting to her phone, thumb scrolling, a small, private world held in her palm. Mark felt a growing frustration, a tightening in his chest. He tried to start a conversation about his day, but her responses were brief, distracted. The meal finished, Sarah retreated to her office, the door closing softly behind her. Mark sat with Rosie, their rescue dog, who rested her head on his lap, her warm weight a comfort. Am I imagining these cracks? He wondered, stroking her fur. Rosie looked up at him, her dark eyes seeming to understand. A few nights later, at Mike Johnson's barbecue, the backyard pulsed with laughter and conversation. Sarah seemed vibrant, laughing easily with the crowd, a lightness in her step Mark hadn't seen in weeks. His eyes found Greg Davis across the patio. Greg was suave, confident, impeccably dressed even in casual clothes, his laugh resonating. Mark watched as Greg engaged Sarah, her eyes bright, posture leaning in, completely absorbed. He saw them sharing inside jokes, a quick glance, a knowing smile. Sarah's hand lightly touched Greg's arm as she laughed at something he said, a casual intimacy that made Mark's stomach clench. Later, Mark caught Sarah leaning close to Greg by the living room corner, their heads almost touching, a familiar intimacy in their gaze. She'd never had that spark in her eyes around him lately, he thought, the observation a cold blade twisting in his gut. The party seemed to fade around them, leaving Mark feeling isolated. Back home, the house felt heavy with unspoken words. Mark tried to approach it gently. You and Greg really clicked tonight, he began, watching her face. Everything fine? Sarah snapped, her voice sharper than he expected. He's just friendly. You're always busy, Mark. I need an outlet. Stop making a big deal out of nothing. She turned away, dismissing him with a shrug. Mark backed off, his heart heavy, a familiar sensation now. He sensed a storm brewing, one he couldn't see clearly, but could feel in the air. Rosie, who had been sleeping by the couch, woke with a low growl, barking aggressively whenever Mark's thoughts drifted to Greg's name, as if sensing the unease. A few days later, Mark arrived home early, a quiet afternoon. As he turned onto their street, he spotted Greg's silver Lexus discreetly parked down the block, almost hidden by a large oak tree. Alarm bells didn't just ring, they clanged, loud and insistent, in his ears. The front door clicked shut behind Mark, echoing in the sudden silence of the house. He'd expected to find Sarah, perhaps on the phone or humming in the kitchen, but the air was still, unnervingly so. Her car was in the driveway, which only deepened the unease. He walked through the living room, past the dining table, into the kitchen, then back towards the office, calling her name. Silence answered him. She wasn't home. He glanced out the window, his gaze drawn to the silver Lexus still parked discreetly down the block. A tightening began in his chest. He pulled out his phone, dialed her number. It rang several times before her voice, slightly breathless, came through. "Mark, what is it?" "Just got home." "Where are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Oh, just at a workshop," she said. "Ran out to pick up some last-minute supplies for the boutique. You know how it is." He knew how it was. Her voice held a note of forced cheerfulness he'd come to recognize. He glanced out the window again. Greg's car remained. A workshop, he thought, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He walked into the bedroom, saw her purse on the dresser. Her phone wasn't in it. He found it on the nightstand, face down. A small, cold impulse led him to pick it up. The screen lit up, displaying a new text message. From Greg. It simply read, "Counting down till tonight." Mark's gut clenched, a cold, hard knot. The vague anxieties, the nagging suspicions, solidified into a brutal, undeniable truth. This confirmed his worst fears, stripping away any pretense. There was no doubt left, only a profound, silent fury. The betrayal settled over him, heavy and cold. A different kind of resolve took root. No hysterics, no shouting, just a chilling clarity. He went to his laptop, the old, reliable machine he used for work. He spent the next few hours researching hidden cameras, focusing on the smallest, most discreet devices available, high-tech and nearly invisible. He learned about remote access, cloud storage, motion detection. He ordered a small package online, ensuring discreet shipping. When they arrived a few days later, Mark waited until Sarah was out, claiming another workshop. He moved with a quiet precision, installing tiny cameras in their home. The first went into the corner of the living room near the bookshelf, angled to capture the main seating area in the fireplace. The second, smaller still, he placed in the entryway, nestled amidst a decorative plant, covering the front door and the hall. He spent an hour setting up the remote access, linking them to his phone and his office computer at Midwest Holdings, testing the feeds repeatedly, watching the empty rooms, the digital clarity stark and unsettling. Over the next few days, Sarah's behavior intensified. More late nights, vaguer excuses. She'd say she was with friends or meeting a new supplier. Her explanations always just a bit too vague, just a shade too hurried. Mark watched her, his expression carefully blank, his mind ticking, observing. Then came the footage. He was in his office, reviewing the day's feed, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The first clip showed Sarah on the phone, her voice barely a whisper, pacing the living room. "Do you think he suspects anything?" she'd asked, a tremor in her voice. Mark's jaw tightened. A few days later, a new clip. The front door opened. Sarah entered, followed closely by Greg. Greg's hand lingered on her arm as they stepped into the living room, a possessive, intimate gesture. Mark watched from his office feed, the familiar furniture of his home now alien, a stage for this unfolding betrayal. Greg laughed, a low, confident sound Mark recognized from the barbecue. He leaned closer to Sarah, whispering something. Mark couldn't make out the words, but Sarah smiled, a soft, intimate smile that turned his stomach. Then a moment that sent a ripple of pure fury through Mark. Greg, his arm now around Sarah's waist, pulled her closer, his gaze sweeping the room with a sneer. "He's too focused on his precious deal to notice us," Greg said, his voice a low, arrogant drawl, loud enough for the camera to pick up. Mark's knuckles turned white on his desk. His precious deal. The words stung with a calculated cruelty. Mark continued to collect evidence, Every glance, every touch, every whispered word. He wasn't acting on emotion anymore, but on a cold, calculated logic. The perfect moment to strike, he knew, was not now, but when he had an airtight case. His plan began to crystallize. You'll regret underestimating me. He meticulously documented every incident, every lie. Dates, times, snippets of dialogue, screenshots from the feeds. A log, precise and unforgiving. Rosie, their rescue dog, also seemed to sense the shift. She became anxious around Sarah when Greg was mentioned, a low growl rumbling in her chest, a restless pacing. She would bark aggressively whenever she heard Greg's car. Her instincts, untainted by human complexities, further validated Mark's suspicions, solidifying his resolve. For another week, Mark continued to gather damning evidence. The hidden cameras became his silent witnesses, documenting every secretive meeting, every affectionate gesture. Phone records, accessed through a carefully worded request to their joint carrier, confirmed the frequency and duration of their calls. He watched, detached, as the pattern solidified. Late-night visits, whispered conversations in the living room, Greg's arm around Sarah's waist, sometimes a lingering kiss by the front door before Greg's Lexus idled away. Each piece of information was meticulously filed, building a dossier that left no room for doubt. He chose a quiet Tuesday evening, after Rosie had been fed, after the dishes were put away. Sarah was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, the television on low. Mark walked in, a manila folder held loosely in his hand. He placed it on the coffee table, sliding it across so it rested between them. The thump echoed in the quiet room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Sarah looked up, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "About what, Mark? Is it work again?" He opened the folder. Inside were printouts of call logs, screenshots from the camera feeds, dates and times noted in his precise handwriting. "It's about you and Greg Davis." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about? He's just a friend. You're being paranoid again." Tears welled in her eyes, a familiar tactic, one he'd fallen for before. "You're always so busy with your deals, you never notice me. And now you're accusing me of this?" Her voice cracked, designed to make him feel guilty, to make him back down. Mark didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone. "Is this what friends do, Sarah?" He pressed play. A recording clear as day filled the room, her voice soft and intimate, whispering, "Do you think he suspects anything?" Then Greg's low chuckle. "He's too focused on his precious deal to notice us." The silence that followed was heavy, crushing. Sarah's face drained of color. The tears stopped. Her shoulders slumped. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I I can explain." "Explain what, Sarah?" he asked, his voice still calm, almost academic. "Explain how you've been seeing him, lying to me, for weeks or months?" She confessed, a torrent of words tumbling out. "You're never here, Mark. You're always working. You're emotionally distant. I needed someone to talk to. He understood." She blamed his busy schedule, his focus on Midwest holdings, anything but her own choices. The devastation hit Mark like a physical blow, a punch to the gut, but he maintained a cold composure, refusing to engage in her emotional theatrics. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering. "Is that all, Sarah?" Mark asked, a new edge in his voice. "Because I also know Greg Davis works for Riverbend Tech." Her eyes widened, fear replacing the last vestiges of feigned hurt. How did you know?" "I know a lot of things," Mark said, "including that Riverbend Tech is Midwest Holdings' biggest competitor for the upcoming Johnson Development Group contract. And I know Greg has been asking you a lot of questions about my work, about our strategies, about our bids." Sarah looked away, her confession a ragged whisper. He he just asked about general market trends and about what it's like working at Midwest. He said he was interested in a career change." Then a sob escaped her. "Sob. He used me, Mark. He said he cared about me, but he just wanted information about the Johnson deal." The realization of both personal and professional betrayal hit Mark with a sickening force. It wasn't just his marriage crumbling. His career, his reputation, perhaps the stability of Midwest Holdings itself, was jeopardized by her actions. His own wife, a pawn in corporate espionage. The cold realism in the room solidified, leaving no air for sentiment. "You will cut all ties with him," Mark stated, his voice a low, unwavering command. "Immediately, and you will cooperate with me, fully." Sarah, desperate, nodded, her face streaked with tears. "Yes, Mark, I promise. I'll end it. I'll do whatever you say." A flicker of doubt crossed Mark's mind. Could he trust her? Could he trust anyone? But he needed her, at least for now. He proceeded with his plan, using her as a reluctant informant, a tool in the intricate game he was constructing. "This isn't just about us anymore, Sarah," he informed her, his gaze hard. "The revenge for this betrayal will involve both our personal lives and my professional standing, and you will be part of it." From that moment, Mark began to subtly isolate Sarah. He maintained an outward facade of a strained but functional marriage for his strategy, but emotionally and socially, he started to build walls, leaving her exposed, alone. She would play her part, whether she liked it or not. The quiet tension in the house was a constant hum. Mark had begun to extract information from Sarah, patiently, methodically, like pulling teeth. He asked about Greg's ambitions, Riverbend Tech's key clients, their bidding strategies for upcoming projects. Sarah, under duress, provided some details, fragments of conversations, names of minor accounts. But Mark, with his trained eye for gaps in data, noticed she held back. Crucial information, the kind that could truly cripple a competitor, remained unsaid, hidden behind her tired eyes. His hidden cameras, still active, soon confirmed his suspicion. Sarah was still secretly communicating with Greg. Not long, intimate calls, but quick texts, hushed warnings Mark pieced together from snippets of audio and rapid thumb movements on her phone. She was trying to warn him, a futile attempt to mitigate the damage Mark was inflicting. He confronted her again, this time with harsher terms. The folder of evidence was still on the coffee table, a constant reminder. "If you don't give me everything, Sarah, I will expose you to everyone. Your family, your clients, at the boutique, your new social circle. I'll make sure they all know exactly what kind of person you are." His voice was low, controlled, but the threat was unmistakable. Sarah, caught in the middle, looked truly trapped. The fear in her eyes was palpable. Fear of Mark's wrath, of the public humiliation he promised, and perhaps a deeper fear of Greg's eventual abandonment. She became a more willing informant, the details now flowing with less resistance, though still filtered through her own self-preservation. Mark used the extracted information with surgical precision. He didn't overtly sabotage Riverbend Tech. Instead, he orchestrated scenarios where Greg's business pitches at Riverbend Tech would seem ill-informed or outdated. A competitor's bid, slightly lower than Greg's expected offer, would miraculously surface just before a crucial presentation. A client's specific, unstated preference for a certain technology would be subtly highlighted by Midwest Holdings, making Greg's proposed solution appear less innovative. These weren't direct attacks, but carefully placed nudges that shifted the perception, eroded trust. Greg started losing significant clients. The Johnson Development Group deal, once a sure thing for Riverbend Tech, slipped through his fingers, landing squarely with Midwest Holdings, largely due to Mark's discreet interventions. Market share dwindled. Mark watched from a distance as Greg grew increasingly frustrated, his emails to Sarah becoming more demanding, his voice on the camera feeds laced with a desperate edge. Mark's colleague, Mike Johnson, a good friend of Sarah's since childhood, a man known for his keen business sense, became suspicious. "Riverbend Tech is dropping like a stone," Mike observed one morning by the coffee machine. "I can't figure it out. Greg Davis used to be sharp." Mark subtly fed Mike information, crumbs of truth mixed with plausible speculation. He mentioned hearing whispers about internal disorganization at Riverbend, about Greg's overconfidence leading to miscalculations. He never directly accused Greg, but he planted enough seeds for Mike to investigate Greg's activities independently. Mike, trusting Mark, took the bait, diving into public records and industry rumors. Sarah, seeing the damage Mark was inflicting, saw the slow, steady unraveling of Greg's career. felt a mix of guilt and fear. The consequences were real, tangible. One evening, she attempted to reconcile with Mark, genuinely expressing remorse for her actions. Her voice was soft, her eyes pleading. "I messed up, Mark. I really did. I hate what this is doing to us." But Mark remained distant, his face a mask of cold resolve. He heard her words, acknowledged them, but felt nothing. His focus was on his endgame, a chessboard of revenge where emotions were a liability. He simply nodded, letting her speak, letting her tears fall without offering comfort. Meanwhile, Mark secured another important client, a regional logistics firm, consolidating his position at Midwest Holdings. His reputation as a meticulous, strategic contract manager only grew. The executives, impressed by his recent successes, gave him more autonomy. Then Mark set his trap for Greg. It involved a major infrastructure contract, a multi-million-dollar deal that Riverbend Tech was also vying for, a project that could make or break Greg's standing within his struggling company. Mark had a solid bid, but he added a layer of complexity, a subtle flaw that would only be apparent to someone with insider information. Sarah, torn between her fear of Mark and her lingering connection to Greg, saw an opportunity to gain some leverage, to perhaps mitigate the destruction. She secretly provided Greg with a partial, misleading piece of information about Mark's strategy for the major contract, a detail seemingly crucial, but ultimately designed by Mark to lead Greg down the wrong path, a final, intricate twist of the knife. Mark was well aware of Sarah's partial deception. He'd seen the quick, furtive text message, the subtle shift in her voice when she'd relayed the information. It was exactly what he expected. He adjusted his plan, turning her misleading intel into a perfectly weighted snare for Greg. The day of the major contract meeting arrived, crisp and cold. The conference room at Johnson Development Group buzzed with anticipation. Mark sat across the polished table from Greg, both men flanked by their respective teams, surrounded by key industry players. Greg, confident and polished, presented Riverbend Tech's proposal. He spoke with authority, hitting points that, unbeknownst to him, Mark had deliberately steered Sarah towards. He emphasized a specific technological integration, a niche market approach, certain financial projections, all based on the flawed intelligence Sarah had provided. Then it was Mark's turn. With practiced ease, he unveiled Midwest Holdings' bid. He systematically, almost gently, exposed the critical miscalculations in Greg's presentation. He highlighted the exact flaws Greg had presented as strengths, showing how his own firm's solution was superior, more robust, and more aligned with Johnson Development Group's true, unstated needs. The room grew silent as Greg's face slowly drained of color, realizing too late the depth of his error. The contract, a multi-million-dollar lifeline, went to Midwest Holdings. Greg was publicly humiliated. Riverbend Tech left reeling. Furious, Greg stormed out of the meeting, his professional reputation in tatters. He suspected a leak, a betrayal. His first call, of course, was to Sarah. The hidden cameras, still active in their home, recorded the ensuing confrontation. "What did you tell him, Sarah?" Greg demanded, his voice tight with rage, as he burst into their living room later that evening. "That information was garbage. You set me up." Sarah, caught in the middle, fully exposed to both men, crumpled. I, I just tried to help," she sobbed, the words pathetic, desperate. "Mark was going to expose everything." She broke down, realizing the depth of her self-inflicted predicament, caught between two men she had betrayed, both now equally vengeful. The raw, desperate honesty of her breakdown, Greg's incredulous accusations, the whole ugly truth was captured, time-stamped. Mark listened to the recording later, a grim satisfaction settling over him. Proof of their mutual deceit, undeniable and complete. He then sent an anonymous tip, a package containing carefully curated evidence of corporate espionage. The recordings, the call logs, the detailed timeline, directly to Riverbend Tech's board of directors. Greg was placed under internal investigation within days, his career hanging by a thread, his carefully constructed facade shattered. The fallout spread rapidly. Emily Peters, Sarah's friend, also Mike Johnson's cousin, heard the rumors first. She called Sarah, her voice clipped, demanding answers. What is all this I'm hearing, Sarah? About you and Greg? And Mark? Sarah, with nothing left to hide, confessed everything. The affair, the corporate espionage, Mark's calculated revenge. Emily listened in stunned silence. Then a wave of disgust washed over her. I can't believe you, Sarah, she said, her voice cold. I truly can't. Emily hung up, severing a friendship that had spanned years. Mark, having collected all the necessary evidence, filed for divorce. The grounds were clear: infidelity and financial misconduct related to the corporate espionage, citing the detrimental impact on his professional standing. The legal documents, once public, became a fresh source of gossip. The news of the affair and the business scandal spread like wildfire through their social and professional circles. Sarah was isolated. Her friends vanished. Her reputation was in tatters. Clients for her boutique, once eager, now pulled back, wary of association. The boutique business, her only remaining source of identity and income, began to suffer. Life's choices often carry a higher price than we imagine, and the unraveling of these decisions can be a brutal spectacle. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The divorce proceedings began with a grim efficiency. Mark's legal team, a formidable pair of litigators, came armed with the overwhelming dossier of evidence he had meticulously compiled. The call logs, the camera footage, the anonymous tip to Riverbend Tech, it all painted an undeniable picture of Sarah's infidelity and complicity in corporate espionage. Her attempts to negotiate to salvage some shred of their shared life were futile. Mark, through his lawyers, demanded full accountability. There was no room for compromise, no quarter given. The judge, presented with the irrefutable facts, ruled heavily in Mark's favor. Citing Sarah's infidelity and her direct role in undermining Midwest Holdings, the court stripped her of almost everything. She lost the house, the significant assets they had accumulated over 7 years, and what remained of her business credibility. Her boutique, already suffering, became unsalvageable. The legal process felt less like a battle and more like an execution, cold and precise. Meanwhile, Greg's fate was sealed. Following the internal investigation, he was officially fired from Riverbend Tech. His name was now mud in the industry, tainted by accusations of unethical conduct and poor judgment. The company, facing its own losses, was considering legal action against him for damages. Mark, not content with merely professional ruin, initiated a civil lawsuit against Greg for damages related to corporate espionage. Greg, now unemployed, disgraced, and facing potential ruin, struggled to find new work in the industry. Every door closed. Sarah, stripped of her comfortable life, her social standing decimated, moved into a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of the city. The contrast to their sprawling suburban home was stark. She faced financial hardship, a reality she had never truly known. The world, once so accommodating, had turned its back. Mark, despite his victories, felt a profound hollowness. The satisfaction he'd anticipated was fleeting, replaced by a deep, unsettling emptiness. The emotional toll of revenge weighed heavily on him, a constant, dull ache beneath his ribs. He had won, but at what cost? His marriage was a casualty, his trust shattered, his heart a hardened shell. The victory tasted like ash. Rosie, their rescue dog, had been withdrawn throughout the ordeal, sensing the discord, often retreating to her bed. Slowly, however, she began to respond to Mark's renewed attention. He spent more time with her, walking her, petting her, her warm presence a small, unburdened comfort in the quiet, empty house. Her loyalty was unwavering, a simple truth in a world that had become complicated and ugly. Mike Johnson, who had initially been a pawn in Mark's intricate game, now fully realized the extent of Greg's manipulative behavior and Sarah's betrayal. He saw the cold, calculated way Greg had used people, including Sarah, to climb the corporate ladder. Mike, a man of integrity, distanced himself completely from Greg, a silent condemnation. He never brought up Sarah, but his quiet support for Mark was evident. One evening, Mark sat alone in the vast, silent living room, the house feeling too big for one person. He reflected on the moral cost of his actions, wondering if the victory had truly been worth the profound pain, the years of his life sacrificed on the altar of retribution. He had sought justice, but had he found peace? A letter arrived a few days later, a thin envelope with Sarah's shaky handwriting on it. He opened it, read it slowly. Her words were simple, stark. She expressed regret, admitting she never truly understood the consequences of her actions, never saw the depth of the ripple effect until it crashed over her. There was no anger, no blame, just a quiet, weary acceptance of her fate. It was a mirror reflecting a truth Mark already knew. Months passed. Mark continued to build his career at Midwest Holdings, his professional standing stronger than ever. He closed more deals, earned more respect, but the accolades felt hollow. A sense of isolation persisted, a quiet void in his life that no amount of success could fill. The house, once full of small, shared moments, now echoed with silence. He saw Sarah by chance at a grocery store one Saturday afternoon. He was pushing a cart. She was in the produce aisle picking through apples. She looked thin, her shoulders slumped, her once vibrant hair dull. Their eyes met across the rows of fruit, and she quickly averted her gaze, a defeated slump to her shoulders. Mark felt an unexpected pang of sadness, not triumph. The sight didn't bring satisfaction. It brought a quiet ache, a ghost of what had been. Then came the predictable, desperate call from Greg. He attempted to blackmail Mark, armed with some old, fabricated stories about Mark's past, minor indiscretions from college, exaggerated and twisted. Mark easily discredited Greg's pathetic attempts, providing evidence that nullified every false claim. The encounter left him feeling dirtied, however, reminded of the ugliness he had submerged himself in. Greg, out of options, faded back into the shadows. Meanwhile, Emily Peters, Sarah's old friend, felt a mix of pity and responsibility. She couldn't fully forgive Sarah, but she couldn't abandon her entirely either. She reached out, offering limited support, a coffee meeting, an occasional phone call. It wasn't true reconciliation, but a lifeline in Sarah's isolated world. Sarah, in turn, found an unexpected solace. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter, spending her days caring for abandoned animals. The unconditional affection of a scared dog, the quiet purr of a rescued cat. It offered a balm to her wounded spirit. It was a stark contrast to her previous life, a quiet penance. Watching all this unfold from a distance, Mark began to question if his pursuit of absolute revenge had truly brought in peace. The emptiness remained. The triumph had curdled into something bitter. He started therapy, a reluctant step, but one he knew he needed to take. He talked about the betrayal, the anger, the grief, the cold, calculating revenge. He spoke about the hollow victory, the lack of satisfaction. During one session, quietly, almost reluctantly, Mark admitted he sometimes missed the old Sarah, the woman he married before the cracks appeared, before the world turned gray. He missed the laughter, the shared dreams, the comfortable silences. It wasn't love, not anymore, but a profound sense of loss for the life they had built. Around this time, Mark reconnected with an old friend, a former colleague from an earlier job. The friend, now a successful entrepreneur, offered Mark a chance at a new venture, a tech startup with ambitious plans, far from the corporate bureaucracy of Midwest Holdings. It was an opportunity for a fresh start, a clean slate, away from the shadow of his past, away from the memories embedded in the office, the house, the city itself. A chance to rebuild not just his career, but himself. He also learned that Greg was facing further financial troubles. His failed blackmail attempts leading to deeper debt. Potential bankruptcy loomed. Mark considered whether to press further with the civil suit, to squeeze every last penny from Greg, or simply let him fade into obscurity, a forgotten casualty. The thought of further pursuit felt draining, pointless. He sat alone on his porch one evening, Rosie curled at his feet, watching the Midwestern sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The question of forgiveness lingered in his mind, not for Sarah or even Greg, but for himself, for the anger he'd harbored, the coldness he'd embraced, the years he'd spent in the relentless pursuit of retribution. Maybe, he thought, it was time to let go. Mark drove east, away from the flatlands of Kansas City, towards the rolling hills of rural Ohio. He needed to talk to his parents to seek solace and perspective, away from the echoes of his recent past. The small, familiar farmhouse, smelling of coffee and damp earth, was a comfort. He sat with them in the kitchen, recounting the events, the betrayals, the calculated revenge, his voice flat, factual. His mother, a woman of deep, quiet faith, listened patiently. When he finished, she placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "you can't carry that anger forever. It will eat you alive. You have to find your peace, even if it means letting go. For yourself, if not for anyone else." Her words, simple and true, resonated with a quiet power. Still wrestling with his emotions, Mark made a surprising decision. He called his lawyers, instructing them to halt the civil suit against Greg. The legal team was perplexed, but Mark was firm. He had made his point. Further pursuit felt like flogging a dead horse, a drain on his energy, a reminder of the ugliness. A few days later, a terse, unexpected message arrived on his phone. From Greg. "Thanks," it read. Nothing more. Mark simply deleted it. The gratitude felt hollow, but the act of letting go felt lighter than he'd anticipated. He poured his energy into his new venture, the tech startup. It was a fresh challenge, building something from the ground up, untainted by the shadow of his past. The work was demanding, but the creation felt clean, purposeful. He found satisfaction in the innovation, in the collaboration with his new team, a stark contrast to the solitary bitter work of revenge. Through Emily, Mark heard snippets of Sarah's life. She was still volunteering at the animal shelter, quietly, humbly rebuilding. She had met a kind, unassuming man named Frank, a fellow volunteer, who didn't know her past, didn't care about her former life, just saw the quiet woman who cared for the discarded animals. Emily relayed this without judgment, simply as fact. One rainy afternoon, while packing up some old boxes in the attic of their now-sold house, Mark found a faded letter. It was from his old self, written years ago, folded inside a book of poetry he'd given Sarah. A love letter full of youthful hope, expressing his love and his dreams for their future. He read it, seeing the man he once was, full of open trust and unbridled affection. It prompted a deep introspection about the man he's become versus the man he wanted to be. The contrast was stark, almost painful. At the startup, Mark made a significant business decision. A potential partnership promised high profits, but had questionable ethical implications for the community it served. Mark, remembering his mother's words, remembering the letter, chose a different path. He opted for a project with less immediate financial gain, but a clear, positive community impact. It was less about profit, more about principle, about building something good. A few weeks later, Mark attended a community event, a fundraiser for a local park. As he navigated the crowded room, his eyes scanned the faces. He saw her, Sarah, across the room talking to Frank, a small, genuine smile on her face. Their eyes met briefly across the throng of people. No anger, no longing, no lingering accusation, just a shared acknowledgement of the past, a silent understanding of all that had happened, all that had been lost. Mark felt a sense of quiet closure then, a chapter finally ending, not with a bang, but a sigh. The air in his chest felt lighter. He realized that true healing wasn't about destroying others, but about rebuilding oneself, brick by painful brick. Mark dedicated himself fully to his new company. It was a tech startup, innovative and ambitious, and it began to flourish. Building it felt different, untainted by the bitterness of his past corporate battles. He fostered a work environment based on trust and integrity, a conscious departure from the cutthroat world he had experienced. His team was loyal, his vision clear. The company built a positive reputation, grounded in ethical practices and genuine progress. Rosie, their rescue dog, thrived in their quieter, more stable home. Her old anxieties, the nervous pacing and aggressive barks, had faded completely. She was a calm, happy presence, a constant reminder of simple, unconditional loyalty. Slowly, cautiously, Mark began dating again. He wasn't seeking perfection or a replacement for what he'd lost. He sought genuine connection, a quiet understanding. He learned to open himself up, little by little, to the possibility of shared moments, of a future built on honesty. Sarah, too, had found a small measure of peace. After her volunteering at the animal shelter, she had started a new modest venture. She focused on handcrafted goods, turning her creative eye to small, artistic projects that brought her quiet satisfaction. Her life was simpler, stripped of the old ambitions, but it was her own. Greg Davis, after falling on hard times, a sequence of failed ventures and mounting debts, eventually found a low-level job out of state. He was completely out of their lives, a fading, unpleasant memory. His impact had diminished, his name no longer causing a ripple in Mark's world. Mark often found himself reflecting on the journey, the intense pain of betrayal, the calculated, cold revenge, and the eventual, quiet understanding that some battles are best left unfinished to find personal peace. He acknowledged that the scars remained, deep and indelible. They were part of his story now, lessons learned, etched into the fabric of who he had become. They didn't define him, but they reminded him. He invested in a local youth mentorship program, channeling some of his company's success back into the community that had borne witness to his struggle. It was a way of giving back, of building something positive from the wreckage. A few months after the program launched, a small, anonymous donation arrived, earmarked for the mentorship fund. Mark saw the familiar, elegant script on the return address, a script he knew almost instinctively. He suspected it was Sarah, a silent acknowledgement, a quiet gesture of shared understanding, a path towards healing, if not forgiveness. The memory of Sarah and Greg still flickered occasionally, a brief shadow across his mind. But it no longer held power over him, no longer ignited the cold fury it once did. It was a story, a part of his past, but not his present. Mark watched a Midwestern sunset one evening, the vast sky ablaze with color, stretching endlessly towards the horizon. The expanse felt like a symbol of endless possibilities, of a future unwritten. He found a quiet contentment in the moment, a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. He understood now that paying the price applied to everyone involved, not just the one who strayed. The deepest lessons were often the hardest learned, carved out of heartbreak and disillusionment. Life went on, not perfectly, never perfectly, but with an earned wisdom, a quiet strength, and a hopeful anticipation for what tomorrow might bring.